Good evening. Can you please turn with me to the book of Esther again and chapter 6 tonight. Esther chapter 6, and we'll start with some verses in chapter 6, and during the course of the meeting we will look at chapter 7 and chapter 8. Those are the three chapters that I'd like to cover tonight. And the reason for that is that they are so closely linked and connected, and they just fit so well together. So our opening readings would be in chapter 6, verse 1. On that night could the king not sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of the records of the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor and dignity have been done to Mordecai for this?" Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, "There is nothing done for him." We trust the Lord to bless these precious words. My intention in these three chapters, chapter 6, 7 and 8, is to focus on a significant day and night in the life of a king. But that same night and day you will find as equally significant in the life of Haman and Esther and Mordecai. But especially in chapter 6, it is the king that we are interested in. In chapter 6, we've come to a dramatic turning point in the book of Esther, and more so in the history of the people of God. Up to this point, Haman rose to great power over the last few chapters that we've seen. Haman seemed to have the upper hand. Things are all under his control to destroy Mordecai and the Jews. But beginning this very night, God's providence turns again against this man, and there was no stopping God. Once God's providence turns against a man, especially an evil and wicked man like Haman, there will be no stopping God. It was a matter of, Haman, beware. His defeat was so complete that in one night and in one single day, he not only fell out with the king, but he was totally and utterly destroyed. He failed to achieve his goal, and his goal was to hang Mordecai. You'd remember in the previous chapter, he was building a gallows so that he can get permission from the king to hang Mordecai. He failed to kill Mordecai. He was killed instead. The story turns on a single night, and it will reach its climax in the following day, in a single day, as two opposing forces, quite independent of each other, both these forces were approaching the king. Haman was approaching the king in order to get permission to slay Mordecai and to destroy the Jews. On the other hand, another force was approaching the king. That was Queen Esther. This time, she wanted to deliver Mordecai and to deliver the Jews. As we've discovered so far, the overall theme of the book of Esther is divine providence. However, as with many other books in the Bible, there are many minor themes and secondary themes that run as undercurrents, as it were. And so we find in the book of Esther more than just the main theme. There's some minor themes, there's some secondary themes running through the book. In chapter 6 to 8, there are at least two minor themes to be observed. And they are the themes of pride and humility. Especially in these three chapters, chapters 6, 7 and 8. They are strong and they support the overall story of Esther. And they are in support of divine providence. They are the themes of pride and humility. Pride is a trap that have led to the downfall of many a believer. Many a person. Humility, on the other hand, is really the key to life in general, but especially in the life of the believer. The greatest example of pride is Satan himself. And the greatest example of humility is our blessed Lord. So we know exactly who we imitate and who we follow if we display either a proud or a humble spirit. The difference will be as clear as night and day. My question to myself and to you is, who are we following? Who are we imitating in terms of our attitude in life and our attitude towards others? You can either follow Christ or Satan. But the contrasts couldn't be any stronger and any sharper than in the case of Haman and Mordecai. Haman was proud, Mordecai was humble, and as a result, Haman was condemned and Mordecai was commended. As a result, Haman was demoted and Mordecai was promoted. Haman was exposed and Mordecai was exalted. And these two things play out very, very well and clear in their own lives. As Haman became exalted and very proud, he was humiliated in the end. He wanted Mordecai and the Jews to be executed, and what happened? He was executed himself. Mordecai, on the other hand, he was the first one to be humiliated in the story. He was the first one to be highly exalted after Haman. He was under the curse of death. And now he's alive. And he reached the highest ladder in the Persian society. He was crowned by the king himself. And here we find God has richly blessed his faithful servant, because God always rewards humility. Mordecai had taken the lowest place, and now he's told to come up higher. The question in verse 6 is, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? That was as if it was said to Mordecai, it's time for you to come up higher. You've humbled yourself. Now you will be exalted. What Haman so much desired in his pride, Mordecai achieved through humility. Think of all the trouble that Haman had to go through. Think of all his fights. Think of all his frustrations with Mordecai and with the Jews. And his only desire was to be exalted. Mordecai got that through humility. Through humility. A humble spirit. These three chapters, chapters 6, 7 and 8, will therefore teach us valuable and important lessons about pride and humility. How do they fit together? In chapter 6, we see pride and humility on display. Both of these things, these issues, are on display in chapter 6. We see Mordecai's humility, we see Haman's pride clearly on display. In chapter 7, we see the outcome of pride. And when you come to chapter 8, you see the outcome of humility. What is the outcome of pride in chapter 7? The outcome of pride is humiliation. What is the outcome of humility in chapter 8? The outcome of humility is exaltation, glory. So starting in chapter 6, pride and humility on display. Even when these two secondary themes, these minor themes are observed, it plays out in the sphere of divine providence, of God's providence. Because in everything, God controls things. He arranges the events and the circumstances for the good of His own. And so at the start of chapter 4, of chapter 6 rather, there are 4 indications of divine providence clearly seen. First of all, in verse 1, the king's insomnia, the king's sleeplessness. It sounds like a little thing, an insignificant, unimportant thing. But this was God at work. Due to divine providence, the king was tossing and turning and he couldn't sleep. God caused this man, He caused this king insomnia, because a whole nation's survival hinged upon his insomnia. Some evil schemes had been carried out by Haman. A gallows are being built. The plans to execute Mordecai had been put into place. And like we noticed last night, Esther and Mordecai knew nothing about it. But God did. God did. And the machine of God's providence kicked in, as it were. We find that the only one who could stop Haman was the highest authority in the country. Who was that? It was the king himself. But he's also Haman's closest ally. So this was an impossibility. Not with God. Not with God. On that night, verse 1 says, could the king not sleep? God kept this man awake, and He used a simple thing as insomnia to bring about Haman's demise, Haman's destruction, and to bring about the Jews' preservation. When Satan put in Haman's heart to destroy, to harm Mordecai, God put it in the heart of the king to honor Mordecai. But this man Mordecai was fast asleep. This was nighttime. He didn't know about the plot against him. He didn't know about the gallows. God, however, was working on behalf of His servant, and He kept the king awake. My brother and sister, we have a God who neither slumber nor sleeps. It doesn't matter how fierce the storm, how great the circumstances, God is still on the throne, and He will remember His own. That's the great encouragement for us from the book of Esther and from this particular chapter. While we are asleep, and that might not even be at night time, the idea is when we are unaware of circumstances, unaware of what's going on around us, the unaware of people, men seeking to harm us, our God never sleeps. He never slumbers. He's constantly working on our behalf to protect us. You remember the prophet's servant? He was worried about the enemy. The prophet wasn't. He knew his God. And he said, Lord, open his eyes. And when he opened his eyes, he saw the mountains filled with the armies of God. My brother and sister, there is a shield of God around you to protect you. There was only one explanation for the king's insomnia. God. God. A second indication of God's or divine providence is the choice of the king's entertainment. Also in verse 1. Whatever the cause of the king's insomnia, he did a really strange thing. He calls for the chronicles to be read to him. You see, the last thing I would want to be entertained is to listen to history, to listen to what happened in the past. The king probably thought, like counting sheep, the monotony of listening to history would put him to sleep. You see, these records go back many, many years, past the time of his father and his grandfather. And there was a lot to choose from. But out of all these records, God guided his servants to this particular record. The one that tells them about Mordecai's actions when he saved the king's life 5 years ago, 5 years back. God not only controlled the king's sleeping patterns, he also controlled the chronicles and the reading of the chronicles, so that Mordecai's good deed will come to light at just the right moment. What is the explanation for the king's choice of entertainment? What's the explanation? God. That's the only explanation. A third indication of God's divine providence is in verse 2 to 3. And that was the delay to reward Mordecai. As a result of the chronicles read to the king, he discovered that Mordecai had never been rewarded. Now, like I said last night, it was common for Persian kings to reward immediately a good deed after it had been done, especially when the king's life had been saved. The king failed to do that 5 years ago. You see, God was behind that, because this was more than the king's reward. This was God's reward. The answer again, God. Another indication, maybe a final indication, of God's divine providence in this chapter, in the life of Mordecai in the book of Esther, is found in verse 4 to 6. And that is Haman's timely arrival. He came at just the right time. How did he know the king was awake in the middle of the night? How did he know that the chronicles was read? It was shortly after the king discovered that Mordecai was never rewarded, and he actually saved his life, that Haman entered the court for permission to hang Mordecai. Unbeknown to him, the king wanted to honor Mordecai, and without mentioning names, the king was asking for Haman's advice, and he wanted to know, he asked Haman, how could I reward in a special way a person in whom I delight? Here's Haman with his big ego, the proud Haman. He could only think of himself. He's thought, that must be me. Who else would be chosen? I was the only one invited to the first banquet. I'm the only one invited to the second banquet. Because pride is only concerned with self. The irony is quite striking. The king asked Haman's advice how to honor Mordecai at the very moment when Mordecai wanted permission to hang this man. And from this point onwards, the irony just grows. Haman sought to humiliate Mordecai and to honor himself. The exact opposite happened. On this day, Mordecai received the honor and Haman was humiliated. He received the very death that Haman planned for him. Haman built the gallows. In the end, he hung upon that very gallows. What is the explanation for Haman's timely arrival? God. Coming to the next section, verse 7 to 11. In responding to the king's request to honor someone, Haman, believing that he was the man, he suggests a public display of honor. And we find that in verse 8 to 9. What else? This was his moment. And listen what he has in mind in verse 8. He says, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, the king's clothes, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. This man wanted it all. Verse 9. And let this apparel and the horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. The king liked what he heard, and in a shocking twist of events, he said to Haman, you go and do that to Mordecai. What a shock. He was cut down to size, as it were. Verse 10, hurry and do that to Mordecai. So in verse 11, proud Haman had no choice. And he faced the most horrible humiliation of his life in the presence of all. He had to run, as it were, in front of his fiercest, his most hated enemy, Mordecai the Jew, singing his praises through the city. He approached the king for permission to kill Mordecai. He ended up giving him the highest honor imaginable. That, however, was not the end of Mordecai's exaltation. He will go higher still. And this is not the end of Haman's humiliation. He will go lower still. And now in verse 12, unlike the previous day, you remember he went home full of gladness and full of joy, and he was boasting to his fan club and to his friends and to his family. The opposite is happening here. Verse 12 says, but Haman hastened to his house mourning, in having his head covered. Why? Who wronged this man? No one wronged him. No one harmed him. It was his pride that dented his ego. And the worst is yet to come in chapter 7. But Haman was eventually warned by his family and friends. They say, you are in big trouble. They are the ones who advised him just the previous day, build a gallows. If you want happiness, build a gallows and get rid of Mordecai. And now, they're changing the tune. Now that they realize things have turned for Mordecai, listen to what they said to him in verse 13, the second part. Excuse me. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. They didn't know much about Mordecai, but they probably remember what was said about the God of the Jews, and how the God of the Jews protected them on the way out of the wilderness and through the wilderness. Remember, they belonged to Amalek. And Amalek was the first enemy and the worst enemy of the Israelites. They were there in the wilderness. They were there in the land. They were there in exile. They probably also remember the greatest king ever, Cyrus the Great. They remember that Cyrus the Great gave permission. He showed these Jews some favors by allowing them to return to their own country, to their homeland, against the wishes and the will of the rest of Persia. And now as they observe Mordecai's exaltation and Mordecai's victory at the expense of Haman, they realize the tide had turned and God is at work on behalf of his people once more. They were correct. God was in control. He is still on the throne. He will remember His own. You see, pride is a terrible thing. Pride convinces us that we are in control. Pride convinces us that we are important, but really, the story of Esther teaches us that pride is a trap, and it will only lead to our destruction, to our demise. Haman devised a plan in chapter 3 to make himself look better. That's pride. No matter that a whole nation will be exterminated as a result. However, pride eventually destroyed Haman. See, every character in the book of Esther had to decide whether they want to live in pride or in humility. Those who chose pride, they came to a mighty fall. Those who chose humility and walked before God in humility rose above the circumstances of the day. How do you and I walk before God? How do we walk before our fellow men? What mark you, my brother and sister? Pride or humility? What about humility? Mordecai never demanded his rights. 5 years ago, when he saved the king's life, he had the right to demand a reward. He never did that. That's a mark of humility. He remained humble and simply went about his business, leaving things and the results with God, in God's hands. Mordecai chose humility. And when he didn't, and when he wasn't rewarded, there was no bitterness toward the king for not having rewarded him. Because when he was rewarded, there was no evidence that he became proud and conceited, as we will see in chapter 8. Esther is another example of humility. She's found in the highest place. She's the queen of the empire. She could have turned her back on her people. She could have been proud and happy for what she's achieved in life and where she was and her success and her power. She did exactly the opposite. She chose, just like Mordecai, she chose humility by putting others first. She put in first the people of God. Paul exhorts us not to think too highly of ourselves, even if the world says, and the world will, if the world says that you have reason to be proud of. You have much to be proud of. The world will tell you it over and over and over again, and our head might swell. Not Esther, not Mordecai. They walked in humility before their God and before the people. So in turning things around for Esther and Mordecai and the Jews, God worked no miracles. The only thing that God used was causing the king insomnia. And he caused one of the greatest deliveries in history. If God could pull off one of the greatest deliveries in history with no miracle, without a miracle, our lives today are saved. We can trust God. We don't have to look for miracles. God can use the ordinary events of our day-to-day lives to bring about our salvation, our deliverance from our circumstances. In fact, the very fact that God is working in our lives is a miracle in itself. So in chapter 6, if chapter 6 highlights the issues of pride and humility, and chapter 7, we see the outcome of pride, which is humiliation. Let's read a few verses in chapter 7. We see the outcome of pride, which is humiliation. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. What is thy request? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given at my petition, and my people at my request. For if we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, The adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. Not only was Haman's pride shattered, this man was humiliated. He was totally destroyed. That is always and will always be the outcome of pride. The story is building here to a climax. The stage is now set for Esther to make a request. You remember, God gave her wisdom and God gave her patience. She had other opportunities, but she waited and she waited. And now the stage is set. By Esther? No. By Mordecai? No. The stage was set by God himself, who brought the good deeds of Mordecai to the king's attention just at the right time. Now the king is more favorable not only towards Esther, but favorable towards Mordecai and indirectly towards the Jews. She's trying to say God set the stage just at the right time. What a lesson in patience. What a lesson in waiting on God for God's time and God's timing. Esther's work was made easy because she was patient. So we realize that Esther had nothing to do with it. God did it all. All that was required of Esther and Mordecai was faith and courage and obedience and humility. God still works out his purposes in his own time and his own ways. And he's using us, you and I, as long as we display those same characters, the same qualities of faith and courage and obedience and humility. Very soon we'll see the outcome of humility in chapter 8, but for now observe with me the outcome of Haman's pride. We finally arrived at the second banquet, where Esther is going to make her approach and a request. We've been waiting for this since chapter 3. Night after night we hear Esther's put it off, and Esther's put it off, and so on. In verse 2, the king said to Esther, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted thee. What is thy request? It shall be performed even unto half of the kingdom. This is the third time that the king has offered half of the kingdom. In verse 3 and 4 of chapter 7, Esther finally opened her heart to the king, and she's making a request. She requested her life and that of her people to be spared, because he said, We are sold to be killed and to be destroyed. Verse 3. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. And then she continued in verse 4 by saying that she would have remained silent. She wouldn't have asked anything if it was simply a matter of enslavement. But when their very lives and their very futures are at stake, she said, I have to speak up. In verse 5, upset about the attack on his wife and the people, the king demanded to know who had the audacity to do such a thing. And then Esther said, think of what Haman must have felt. What was he going through? The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Proud Haman, boastful Haman, he was not only terrified, he was humiliated. That is the outcome of pride. How will the king respond? Verse 7. The king arose in his anger. He left the banquet and went for a walk in the garden. He felt angry. Oh, not only because of the decree that was issued to kill his wife, but he felt betrayed. Haman betrayed his trust. He gave him all the authority to write out a decree, to write up a decree. And Haman used that power to write something and put something in place to kill his wife and the people, her people. The king was unaware of the detail. Yes, we can blame the king. He should have asked questions, but he felt betrayed. He felt used because he literally, indirectly signed a decree to kill his own wife. Rather than making a foolish and a rash decision as is done earlier, the king this time went for a walk. He was showing some wisdom. Instead of making a decision that he will regret later, he was considering the matter carefully by just being on his own. Haman realized, on the other hand, that the king had turned against him, and the outcome can only be disastrous. So while the king is gone, went for a walk, thought about things, Haman was on his knees, pleading with the queen. How interesting and ironic. Just a day earlier, he was going to hang a Jew for refusing to bow before him. He is now bowing before a Jew. And that a woman begging for his life. What humiliation! The outcome of pride. How wonderful to see how God turns the tables on Satan. Haman's plan is exposed. He's falling down before Esther, begging for mercy. He wanted the Jews to bow before him. Now he bows before a Jew. Remember what the Lord said to one of his faithful churches in Revelation chapter 3, verse 9. He says, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, to know that I have loved thee. In verse 8, on his return, the king is coming back. On his return, he found Haman in this position, a compromising position. And he was misunderstanding Haman's intentions. He probably thought that Haman was trying to force the queen to withdraw her accusation or seeking revenge on her. This was the last straw for the king. This was the end of Haman. He finally came to a fall. Nothing else but the outcome of pride. The wisdom writer says, pride cometh before the fall. And as the king spoke, his servants covered Haman's face. That was a sign of humiliation, a sign of condemnation. He was in such a position, such disfavor, that he was unfit to be looked upon. And so they hung Haman on the same gallows that he built for Mordecai. It was pride that led to his humiliation. He who wanted to humiliate Mordecai before the nation, he is now humiliated before all. Listen to Proverbs 26 and 27. It says, whoso diggeth a pit shall fall therein, and he that rolleth a stone, it will return upon him. The opposite is true for Mordecai. His fate became Haman's fate. Again, resorting to Proverbs 11, verse 8. The righteous is delivered out of trouble, and the wicked cometh in his stead. What a summary of what's happening in chapter 7. Chapter 6 was very clear. Pride, humiliation on display. Here we find out and discover that the outcome of pride is humiliation. My brother and sister, let us choose, don't choose pride. choose humiliation. Why? Chapter 8 will answer that question. Chapter 8 tells us that the outcome of humility, the reason why we should choose humility, the outcome of humility is always exaltation and glory. Chapter 8 verse 1. The Jews' enemy, he was the Jews' enemy unto Esther the queen, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. Verse 2. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Since the introduction of Mordecai in chapter 2, he stands out for several reasons. As we get to know Mordecai better and better from chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and now chapter 8, he stands out for his courage, for his zeal, for his faithfulness, his obedience. But underneath it all, underneath these wonderful qualities, there was a great humility. And from chapter 8 onwards, his humility is rewarded. He's exalted. He's lifted up. And we observe his rise to the highest and to the greatest of powers. However, he's not the only one rewarded here in chapter 8. Chapter 8 starts with Esther being rewarded. Just as Mordecai never demanded a reward for his deeds, Esther also never claimed compensation for what she had to suffer as the queen and as a Jew, being under the death of the threat of death itself. However, her humility is now rewarded in verse 1. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen, probably to compensate for her suffering. The spotlight in chapter 8, however, is on Mordecai's exaltation. You remember in chapter 2, he didn't allow Esther to reveal his identity, to reveal her identity. He said, don't tell him you're a Jew. The result? Esther was chosen and crowned as queen. Then in chapter 4, he challenged her to reveal her identity, which was dangerous. The result? Both the Jews and Esther were preserved. And now in verse 1, he had allowed her to reveal his own identity, telling the king that they are related. And as a result, they were both rewarded. So this man is not only marked by humility, he was marked by great wisdom. In verse 2 and verse 15, Mordecai was exalted. He's promoted to the very position that Haman occupied. And so the king offered him his ring, a symbol of his authority, which had given to Haman. It now belongs to Mordecai. And further, Esther, who had been given the property and all the wealth of Haman, she put Mordecai in charge of everything. The exaltation that that Haman formerly enjoyed, and the honor that he so craved for, now belonged in all its fullness to his enemy, Mordecai. The reversal is now complete. However, there still remained one big problem. A problem not yet overcome, and that was the decree to kill the Jews in 12 months' time. Remember, this was the law of the Medes and Persians. It couldn't change. The problem wasn't solved. Haman had been dealt with, but his decree was unalterable, and it still stood. That tells us something about the lasting effects of sin. Sin will affect me, but sin will also affect others. And it might be lasting even after I'm gone. Haman's decree outlived him, but the effect of his wickedness continued on. And it can happen to you and me as well today. whatever we initiate in life, in the assembly, whatever we say, whatever we do, may affect others more than it affects us. We might regret it. And we might say sorry. And we might repent. But there might still be others, the next generation, that will suffer as a result of my decisions and my action. What am I going to leave behind in this world? A legacy of wickedness, or something that will be beneficial to the people of God? In verse 3 to 6, Esther approached the king. They have a problem. The decree still stands. She fell at his feet and pleading with him for this to be changed. We have another important lesson for us today in this few verses, verse 3 to 6. We may not have the responsibility for people who are in danger of death. Esther had that responsibility. She went to the king. We don't have that. But what about the many who face spiritual death? We have a great responsibility to warn them of the dangers of hell and the lake of fire, of eternal destruction. Sin and Satan are causing destruction wherever they go. A destruction that is far worse than physical death. If Esther needed to speak up on behalf of those who are facing physical death, my brother, you and I have more reason to speak out and to warn people of eternal death, to save them from their sin. If we have a love for the people as Esther had a love for the people, we must speak out. If we don't, it will be a sign that we have no love for the souls of men. In verse 8, although the law of the Persians could never be reversed, the king in this case granted permission for Esther and Mordecai to write a new law, a new decree to counter the first. It was to be written in his name and to be sealed with his ring. And so in verse 9, once again, the scribes are called, just like in chapter 3, with the first decree, the scribes are called in to write another decree. Of the Bible's over 31,000 verses, this verse 9, is the longest. 90 words in the King James Version. The first decree of Haman authorized the killing of all the Jews. But the second decree that they've written authorized all the Jews to defend themselves and to take the spoil. Under the first decree, they had the forces of the whole empire against the Jews. Under the second decree, the forces of the whole empire was with the Jews, supporting the Jews. Chapter 8 ends with the desire, therefore, of many in the empire. What was their desire? I'm not even talking about the Jews. Listen to verse 17. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Not only was there humiliation for Haman, there was humiliation for all the people who stood with Haman. Not only was there exaltation for Mordecai, there was an exaltation for all the Jews who stood with Mordecai. Everybody wanted to be like the Jews. You remember after the first banquet, Haman was glad and joyful as he went home boasting. While after the second banquet here, it was the Jews' turn to be joyful and glad, to feel the same. However, in the sphere of complete reversals and exaltations, they had something that Haman never had. Haman was only glad and joyful. Listen to what the Jews experienced in verse 16. It says, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. That is the very thing that Haman craved for. He just wanted honor at whatever cost. The Jews had it all. Why? Was it because their lives were saved and their future was secure? Well, yes, it was that, but it was much more than that. The real reason for their joy and their gladness, and especially their honor, as given in the previous verse, verse 15. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in the royal apparel of blue and white. And the last part says, the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Haman was given the kings and the royal apparel. Haman was given the highest place in the empire. Who was Haman? A Benjaminite, a Jew. The Jews had honor and gladness and joy because they had someone in the highest place in the empire. We have reason to be joyful and glad. We should have honor as well, because our Lord, He humbled Himself, and He was further humiliated at the hands of men, but God highly exalted Him. He gave Him a name above every name. He gave Him a crown, just like in Mordecai's place. He gave Him honor. He is now at the right hand of the Father, the highest place in heaven. He is our advocate. He is our comforter. He intercedes for us. My brother and sister, we have a Benjaminite, a son of God, at the right hand of God, in the highest place, our heavenly Mordecai. We should be joyful. We should be glad. What happened to this hated Jew? One convicted to be hanged. His humility saved the day. His humility saved the day. Look where he got. The outcome of humility was and will always be exaltation. Verse 15 says, the city of Shushan rejoiced. You see, humility is never about self, as pride is. It's always about others. Listen to verse 15. The city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Verse 16. The Jews, Mordecai's action, his name's action, the Jews had light and so on. Verse 17. And in every province and every city, the Jews had joy. And towards the end, many of the people of the land became Jews. Everybody had gladness and joy. What happened to Mordecai? It's not about me. It's not about Mordecai. He had the attitude of humility. The outcome of humility is exaltation. But the greatest feature of humility is others. Because humility is always others-centered. Listen to the greatest chapter in the Bible on humility. Philippians chapter 2 verse 4. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. That's said of Christ. In that same chapter, we see the actions of Paul, and it was on others. And we see the actions of Timothy, it's on others. And we see the actions of Epaphroditus, it was on others. Paul says, let this mind of Christ be in you. Why? Because the mind of Christ was others-centered. What is the outcome of others-centeredness? Humility. And what is the outcome of humility? Exaltation. As we close, although the overall theme of the book of Esther is divine providence, in chapter 6 to 8, we've noticed the two minor themes that are very important to the story of this book: pride and humility. You will find, and we've learned, pride is concerned with who is right. Who is right? It's always about me. It's always about myself, about my ego. Pride is concerned with who is right. Humility is concerned with what is right. You remember what Mordecai did? When his young niece, his cousin, was left homeless and orphaned with no way to repay him, he just did what was right. He took it in. Humility. He never demanded a price, a reward. Humility. He just did what was right. He saved the king's life because it was the right thing to do. He sacrificed himself for his people because that was the right thing to do. Humility led to the exaltation of Esther and Mordecai and Christ and the apostles, it is still the outcome for every believer if we live for humility and strive after humility and display an attitude of humility. The outcome of humility is always exaltation. Therefore, my brother and sister, let's continue to put others first. Let's continue to put away a proud spirit. Let's continue to do what is right in order to display a spirit of humility. The Lord will bless His word. Amen.